Maria had never expected life to be so hard. When she found out she was pregnant with twins, it felt like a dream come true at first. She had always wanted to be a mother, to have a family, and to give love to her children. But everything quickly changed when she found herself alone with no one to help her. Maria had always been poor, but she had never imagined things would get this bad. She lived in a small, run-down apartment at the edge of the city, with peeling paint on the walls and broken windows. Every month was a struggle, trying to pay bills that seemed to grow higher with each passing day. There was no one around to help her, no family, no friends who could step in and offer any support. Her boyfriend, the father of the twins, had left her soon after she told him about the pregnancy. He'd disappeared without a trace, leaving Maria to fend for herself. She had tried everything. She went to government agencies, applied for financial aid, and begged for help from anyone who would listen. But nothing seemed to work. The bills piled up, and the pressure only grew heavier. When the babies were born, it was both a blessing and a curse. She loved them with all her heart, but she had nothing to offer them. How could she take care of them? She barely had enough money to feed herself, let alone 2 newborns. The stress of caring for the babies became too much. She was constantly tired, unable to get enough rest. The crying never stopped, and there was no one to share the responsibility with. Maria had always been a strong person, but the weight of motherhood without any help was crushing. Each day felt like an endless struggle with no way out. She was starting to lose hope. One cold evening after another sleepless night, Maria sat in the small living room of her apartment, looking at her babies. Sophia, the older twin by just a few minutes, was quietly asleep in her crib, her tiny hands curled into fists. Jackson, her brother, was awake and crying, his face red with frustration. Maria picked him up, trying to calm him, but he only cried, louder. She rocked him gently in her arms, feeling the exhaustion take over her body. She knew she couldn't keep going like this. She thought about the future, and the more she thought, the more hopeless everything seemed. What could she possibly offer these children? What kind of life could she give them when she could barely take care of herself? She thought of all the people who had turned their backs on her, who had told her she was foolish for having kids when she couldn't even support herself. What if she couldn't give them a future? What if they were better off without her? Maria didn't want to hurt her babies. She loved them more than anything, but in her darkest moments, the idea of letting them go seemed like the only way to give them a chance at a better life. She remembered hearing stories about babies abandoned in parks or forests, only to be found by someone who could give them the care they needed. Maybe someone would find them, take them in, and give them the life she couldn't. She could never afford to put them up for adoption, but maybe they didn't need to be with her to survive. Maybe someone better could take care of them. As the days passed, Maria's thoughts grew darker. The idea of abandoning her children seemed more and more like the only solution. She cried every night, torn between her love for them and the overwhelming sense of failure. She couldn't go on like this anymore. Something inside her told her that she had to do it for their sake, even if it meant breaking her own heart. One night, when the cold wind blew through the cracks in the walls, Maria made her decision. She gathered her babies in her arms, wrapped them tightly in blankets, and walked out into the night. The streets were empty, the only sound the crunching of snow beneath her feet. She didn't know exactly where she was going, but she knew she couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't keep them in a place that was so full of pain and emptiness. After walking for what seemed like hours, Maria found herself in the woods near the edge of the city. She had passed through this area before, but it never looked so dark and lonely. She stood there for a moment, staring at the trees that seemed to stretch on forever. It was quiet here, almost too quiet, but somehow it felt like the right place. The world around her felt so distant, like she was alone in her own thoughts, away from everything that had brought her to this point. Maria carefully placed the babies down on the ground, their little faces still peaceful in their sleep. She kissed each one gently on the forehead, whispering that she loved them, even though they wouldn't remember. The tears flowed freely from her eyes as she looked at them one last time, knowing this was the hardest thing she would ever do. She hoped, prayed that someone would find them soon, that they would be taken to a better life, a life she could never provide. She stood there for a long time, unable to move, unsure of what would happen next. The wind began to pick up, making the trees sway above her. She wiped her tears and took one last look at her children, then turned away, walking back toward the city. Her heart felt like it was breaking with every step she took. She had no idea what the future would hold, but she knew she couldn't be the mother they needed. As she walked back to the city, Maria couldn't stop thinking about her babies. Would they be found? Would they be safe? She thought about the lives they could have, the lives she couldn't give them. She tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept coming back, haunting her. She had no choice now but to wait and hope that someone somehow would come along and save them. The woods were quiet as Alexander Hayes jogged through the crisp morning air. He had been running in these same woods for years, using the peaceful surroundings to clear his mind and escape from the stresses of his life as a CEO. His company, one of the largest in the country, was always in the spotlight, and he often felt the pressure to be perfect. But today, as he ran through the familiar trails, it felt different. His thoughts were heavier than usual, weighed down by recent challenges at work, and he found himself hoping that this time the run would bring some clarity. Alexander had always been someone who thrived on control. He liked order, planning, and knowing what was coming next. But lately, the unpredictable nature of life had been leaving him frustrated. He didn't understand why things didn't always go according to plan. That frustration had led him to the woods, hoping the simplicity of nature would help calm his mind. As he neared the heart of the forest, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves filled his ears. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows on the ground. Everything seemed so peaceful, a sharp contrast to the whirlwind of thoughts in his head. He slowed his pace, letting the fresh air fill his lungs, and took a deep breath. It was moments like these that made him feel connected to something bigger than himself, something that didn't need constant management or control. But that morning, something caught his attention. As he rounded a corner, he noticed a figure in the distance. It was a woman walking briskly but with an air of urgency. Her movement seemed hurried, as if she was trying to get somewhere quickly, but the way she carried herself, tired and weighed down, struck Alexander. There was something off about her, something that didn't fit with the peaceful surroundings of the woods. But before he could think too much about it, the woman vanished from his sight as she disappeared behind a cluster of trees. Alexander hesitated, then decided to continue running. He pushed his thoughts aside, focusing on his rhythm, but something kept nagging at him. It wasn't just the woman, there was something in the air, a sense of unease he couldn't shake. It was a strange feeling, like he was being watched or like something was about to happen that he couldn't predict. He ran faster, hoping that the speed would shake off the growing feeling of discomfort. But as he turned another corner, he spotted her again. This time she was crouching down near the base of a tree, her back to him. At first it looked like she was gathering something from the ground. He couldn't make out what it was, but something about her actions made him stop in his tracks. There was a strange stillness to the scene, a quiet that was almost unnatural. As he got closer, his heart skipped a beat. The woman was holding 2 babies. His eyes widened in shock as he realized what he was seeing. The woman was gently placing the babies, wrapped in blankets, on the ground beneath the tree. The scene felt surreal, like something out of a dream. For a moment he thought he had to be mistaken. But there they were, 2 tiny babies, their innocent faces barely visible under the folds of their blankets. Alexander's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what was happening, but his instincts told him he had to act fast. He had been a businessman for most of his life, making decisions with a quick mind and a clear sense of purpose. But this moment was different. It wasn't about money or negotiations. It was about lives, about 2 tiny children who had been left alone in the woods. He looked at the woman again, but she was already turning away, walking briskly down the path, disappearing into the distance. Alexander stood there for a moment, frozen in shock. Was she leaving them? Why was she leaving the babies? His mind raced with questions, but his body moved before he could fully process them. Without thinking, he rushed toward the babies. His feet crunched on the leaves and he felt a wave of panic flood over him. What if they were hurt? What if they needed help? His thoughts were scattered, but all he could focus on was reaching them. When he finally reached the twins, he knelt down, beside them, his heart racing in his chest. The babies were tiny, barely a few months old. One was sleeping soundly while the other, a little boy by the looks of him, was whimpering softly, his eyes wide and confused. They looked so helpless, so vulnerable. Alexander could hardly believe what he was seeing. How could someone leave these babies here alone in the woods? He scooped them up carefully, one in each arm, his mind still spinning with disbelief. The babies were so small, their little bodies limp in his arms, but he could feel the warmth of their skin against his. They were alive, and that was the only thing that mattered. He quickly checked around, hoping to find any sign of the woman who had left them, but there was nothing. She had vanished into the trees, leaving the babies behind as if they were nothing more than forgotten possessions. His mind whirled as he made his way back down the path. He had to get the babies to safety. He had to make sure they were okay. He was a man who had built his life on making quick decisions, on finding solutions to problems. But this wasn't just another business problem. It was a matter of life and death, and the weight of that responsibility hit him all at once. Alexander's thoughts turned to the children's future. Who were they? Where had they come from? Why had the woman left them behind? He couldn't stop the questions from flooding his mind, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just leave them there. He would take them home, care for them, figure out what to do next. There had to be a reason this had happened, a reason that he was the one to find them. By the time he reached his car, the babies had stopped crying. He settled them gently in the back seat, his hands trembling as he buckled them in. They were so small, so fragile, and he felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility toward them. He didn't know how he was going to handle this, but one thing was clear. These babies needed him. He drove quickly, his mind racing with 100 thoughts. He needed to call someone to get help. He needed to figure out who the babies belonged to and why they were left alone in the woods. But more than anything, he needed to make sure they were safe. They were his responsibility now, and he wasn't about to let them down. As the car sped toward the city, Alexander glanced in the rearview mirror at the twins. They were still asleep, their tiny chests rising and falling with each breath. Despite the chaos of the situation, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. There was no going back now. He had made a choice. And in that moment, he knew he would do whatever it took to protect them. When Alexander Hayes arrived back at his mansion, he couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling of responsibility that weighed heavily on his shoulders. He carefully carried the two babies into his home, their tiny faces still relaxed in peaceful sleep. His grand estate was quiet, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of thoughts racing through his mind. He wasn't a father. He had never considered the possibility of becoming one. His life had always been about business, leading a massive company, negotiating contracts and traveling around the world. But now, as he held these two fragile babies, something deep inside him shifted. These babies had no one but him. He didn't know how or why this had happened, but in that moment Alexander felt an undeniable pull to protect them. He immediately contacted the authorities, not knowing exactly what steps to take. His mind was scattered, unsure whether he should call the police or a social services agency. It didn't feel right to simply hand the babies over to anyone without knowing their background. He wasn't sure where the woman had gone or why she had abandoned them, and he couldn't let that unanswered question go. But what mattered most at that moment was ensuring the babies were safe and well cared for. After calling the police and explaining what had happened, he waited for them to arrive. The babies had settled into a deep sleep by then, their little bodies cradled in soft blankets that Alexander had found in a closet. He sat by their side, keeping a watchful eye, as his thoughts raced. He couldn't understand how a mother could leave her children in such a vulnerable position, especially in a place as harsh and cold as the woods. Was it desperation? Was she too overwhelmed by her circumstances? His mind continued to search for answers, but every possibility felt unsatisfying. When the authorities finally arrived, Alexander explained the situation, and they took the babies to a local orphanage for immediate care. The police had done their part in collecting information, but Alexander couldn't just walk away. He had to know more. There was something about this case that tugged at him, something he couldn't ignore. The next few days were a blur for Alexander. Between business meetings, press events, and boardroom discussions, his thoughts kept returning to the babies. He couldn't stop thinking about their tiny faces and how vulnerable they were. He had tried to push the feeling aside. After all, he wasn't their parent and he didn't have the time or expertise to care for them, but it didn't work. Every time he tried to concentrate on his work, his thoughts would return to the children, their uncertain future hanging in the air like a cloud he couldn't shake. Then, one evening, after a particularly exhausting day of meetings, Alexander found himself driving back to the orphanage where the babies were being cared for. He had made up his mind. He couldn't just be a passive observer anymore. He couldn't stand by and wait for someone else to take care of them. He needed to take action. When he arrived at the orphanage, he was greeted by a warm, kind-hearted woman who worked there. Her name was Linda, and she quickly explained that the babies were doing well under the care of the staff. They had been fed, bathed, and given medical checkups, but they were still unsettled, likely because they were so young and had already experienced so much change. Linda spoke with a sense of tenderness that made Alexander's heart ache. She told him that while the babies were safe, there were still many questions to answer. Who had abandoned them? Why? Was their mother ever going to come back for them? Her words stung. He didn't know the answers to those questions either, but he knew one thing. He couldn't simply walk away from this situation. As much as he tried to convince himself that he wasn't qualified to be a father, he couldn't ignore the feeling that these babies were meant to be in his life. They needed him, even if he didn't know exactly how to care for them just yet. Alexander visited the orphanage every day after that, learning more about the babies, watching them grow a little stronger each day. Sophia, the girl, was quiet and calm, while Jackson, the boy, was more active, often stretching his arms and legs in playful bursts of energy. They were so different, yet they were so clearly a part of each other. Alexander couldn't stop thinking about their mother. What had driven her to leave them? What kind of person was she? After several days of visits, Alexander decided to do some research. He didn't want to be the type of man who just stepped in and adopted the babies without fully understanding their story. It felt wrong to him. So he used his resources and connections to track down any information about the woman who had left them. He hired investigators and worked with the authorities to try to uncover anything they could about her identity. It was difficult, though. There were no leads, no records to follow, just the emptiness of the woods where she had left them. But Alexander wasn't ready to give up. His mind wouldn't let him rest. He knew he had to find her, or at least understand her better before making any decisions about the baby's future. Every day he became more invested in their well-being. He started to feel like a father, even if he hadn't officially adopted them yet. He had grown attached to them, and it was becoming impossible to imagine life without them. He was getting closer to answers, though they weren't coming as quickly as he had hoped. But there was one thing that kept him grounded: the bond he was beginning to form with the twins. Even if he didn't know their story or their mother's reasons for abandoning them, he knew he couldn't turn his back on them. He would be their protector, their caregiver, and if fate had led him to this moment, he was ready to embrace it. Maria had never felt so lost in her life. Each day felt like an uphill battle, as if she was constantly fighting against an invisible force that pushed her deeper into despair. She thought about her twins every single day, Sophia and Jackson, her precious babies who she had abandoned in the woods months ago. She often found herself replaying that moment over and over in her head, each time feeling the sharp sting of guilt. She couldn't escape it no matter how hard she tried. After leaving her children in the woods, Maria had gone into hiding. She couldn't bring herself to face anyone, especially the people who had always told her she wasn't good enough. In a way, she felt that leaving her children behind was the ultimate proof of that. She couldn't take care of them. She couldn't give them a life. But as the days passed, she began to realize just how wrong that decision had been. The emptiness inside her grew every time she thought of them. What were they doing now? Were they safe? Had they found someone who could give them the love and care they needed? She had tried to move on. She worked long hours at various low-paying jobs just to make ends meet. She stayed in tiny, cheap apartments, always on the move, never staying in one place for too long. But no matter where she went, she couldn't escape the memory of her children. They were always with her, even though she hadn't seen them since that painful day in the woods. Maria had heard rumors, whispers here and there, about a man who had found 2 babies abandoned in the woods. At first, she didn't want to believe it. She couldn't bear the thought of someone else taking care of them growing up without her. But as time went on, she couldn't ignore it. The stories kept coming, and her curiosity began to grow. Who was this man? What had happened to her children? Had they been adopted? Were they being raised by someone who loved them? The more she heard, the more she wished she could somehow find a way to see them again. But how could she face them? How could she explain the decision she had made? She had betrayed them, and the guilt was something she couldn't escape. Still, her heart longed to see them, to make sure they were okay, to know they were loved. One day, as she was walking home from work, Maria heard a conversation between 2 women at a coffee shop. They were talking about a millionaire CEO named Alexander Hayes, who had adopted 2 twin babies. The women were discussing how Alexander had found them abandoned in the woods, and how he had become a loving father to them. Maria's heart skipped a beat. Could this be true? Had someone actually taken her children in? Was it possible that they had a better life now, a life she could never have given them? Her curiosity was overwhelming. She had to know more. She spent the next few days researching Alexander Hayes, trying to learn everything she could about him. She found articles online, read interviews, and even watched videos of him talking about his work and his charitable efforts. He seemed like a good man, kind, compassionate, and successful. But the more she learned, the more afraid she became. How could she just show up in his life, especially after what she had done? How could she tell him the truth? Maria spent sleepless nights debating what to do. She felt torn between the hope that her children were being well cared for and the fear that she was too late. What if they didn't even remember her? What if they hated her for what she had done? Every time she thought she was ready to reach out, the doubts would creep in, holding her back. Eventually, Maria could no longer ignore the voice in her head urging her to take action. She decided to find a way to contact Alexander Hayes. She didn't want to just show up at his door unannounced. That would be too much. Instead, she wrote a letter. In it, she explained who she was and what had happened, admitting her terrible decision to leave her babies behind in the woods. She told him how much she regretted her actions and how she hoped that her children were thriving under his care. She asked if there was any chance she could see them again, just for a moment to make sure they were okay. The letter was a painful thing to write. Maria poured her heart into it, but at the same time, it felt like she was exposing her deepest shame. She wasn't sure if she would ever hear back, but she knew she had to try. It was the only thing that might bring her some peace. After mailing the letter, Maria felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but at least she had taken the first step. For the first time, in months, she felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe she would get to see her children again. Maybe they would understand. Maybe they would forgive her. Even if they didn't, she would know that they were okay. Days passed, and Maria anxiously waited for a response. She tried to keep herself busy with work, but her mind was constantly on Alexander Hayes and the twins. She wondered what they were doing, how they were growing, and if they ever thought about her. She often found herself imagining what their lives were like now. Were they happy? Were they loved? Were they safe? Then one afternoon, as she was returning to her small apartment, Maria's phone rang. She stared at the number on the screen, unsure of what to expect. Her heart raced as she answered the call. On the other end, a voice spoke with a calm but warm tone. "Hello, is this Maria?" the voice asked. "Yes, this is Maria," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Who is this?" "This is Alexander Hayes," the man said. "I received your letter, and I want to talk with you. Could we meet?" Maria's heart skipped a beat. It was him. The man who had taken her children in. The man who had given them a home. Her breath caught in her throat as she tried to gather her thoughts. What was she supposed to say? She felt like everything had led to this moment, and now she had to face him, face the truth of her actions. "Of course," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I'd like that." As soon as the call ended, Maria sat down on the nearest chair, her mind spinning. This was it. She had the chance to see her children again, to apologize, to tell them the truth. But there was no turning back now. She had to be brave, no matter how difficult it was. The day Maria had been dreading and hoping for had finally arrived. She was about to meet the man who had taken her children in, a man she had only known through news reports and rumors. Alexander Hayes, the wealthy CEO who had found her twins, abandoned in the woods, had agreed to meet her in person. Maria's heart was pounding with both nervousness and excitement. She had so many questions, but more than anything, she needed to see her children again, to know they were okay, and to apologize for what she had done. The meeting was set to take place at one of Alexander's private homes, a quiet place away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Maria arrived early, unsure of what to expect. She had worn simple clothes as she didn't want to seem out of place in his world, but the nerves made it hard to feel comfortable in anything. Her mind was racing, and every step she took seemed to echo in her ears. She couldn't stop thinking about how much time had passed since she had left the twins. Would they even recognize her? Would they remember the love she once had for them? When she arrived at the front door, Alexander greeted her with a warm smile. He didn't seem cold or distant like she had feared. Instead, his eyes showed understanding, as if he already knew how difficult this was for her. His kindness made Maria's chest tighten with emotion. "Maria, it's good to finally meet you," he said gently. "Please come in." As she stepped into the house, Maria felt an overwhelming sense of awe. The place was elegant, but not in a way that made her feel uncomfortable. It was the kind of home that felt warm and inviting. Soft light filtered in through large windows, casting a peaceful glow over the room. Alexander led her into the living room where they both sat down, the air between them filled with an unspoken tension. Maria didn't know where to begin. She felt like everything she had done was hanging in the balance and she had to explain it all. But how could she possibly make him understand? How could she explain the impossible choice she had made? "I don't know where to start," Maria said quietly, her voice trembling. I don't know what to say. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know how sorry I am for what I did. I never wanted to hurt my babies. I couldn't do it. I couldn't take care of them. I was so lost, so overwhelmed. I thought leaving them would give them a better chance at life." Alexander listened carefully, his expression softening as he heard her words. He didn't interrupt her. He simply let her speak. His silence wasn't judgmental. Instead, it was a sign of understanding, of patience. Maria continued, her voice becoming more steady as she spoke from her heart. "I love them so much," she said, tears filling her eyes. "I still love them, but I couldn't do it on my own. And I thought maybe someone else could give them the life I couldn't. I never meant for them to be abandoned, and I never meant to hurt them. I didn't know what else to do." For a moment, there was only silence between them. Maria's heart was racing, her hands shaking as she gripped the armrest of the chair. She couldn't look at Alexander, afraid of what she might see in his eyes. Was he angry? Disappointed? She didn't know if she could bear the weight of his judgment. But then, to her surprise, Alexander spoke in a calm, reassuring voice. "Maria," he began, "I understand more than you think. You were in a difficult situation. You did what you thought was best at the time, and I don't think anyone can truly understand how hard that must have been for you. The fact that you care so much about your children, that you came here today to apologize, shows me that you are not the person you think you are. You're not someone who abandons her children out of selfishness. You were just lost, and I think you made the best decision you could with the information you had. Maria looked up at him, surprised by the compassion in his voice. It wasn't what she had expected. She had feared he would be cold and distant, maybe even angry with her. But instead he was showing her kindness, offering her a chance to redeem herself even if she didn't deserve it. I've been raising Sophia and Jackson now for several months, Alexander continued. They're healthy, happy, and they're surrounded by love. They're my children now, and I'm doing everything I can to give them the best life possible. But that doesn't mean they don't deserve to know who you are, Maria. You're their mother, and you'll always be their mother. I think they should have a chance to know you, to know where they come from. Maria's heart swelled with emotion. She hadn't expected such understanding. She had been so afraid that Alexander would tell her she had no place in her children's lives. But instead he was offering her a chance to be part of their future. The thought that she could be in their lives again, even in a small way, filled her with a sense of relief she hadn't realized she needed. I want to see them, Maria said, her voice breaking. I need to know they're okay. I want to be a part of their lives, even if it's just a little. Alexander smiled softly. I think that can be arranged. I don't know what the future holds, but I think we can start by letting you be part of their lives in a way that feels right. We'll take it one step at a time. Maria felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. The fear that had haunted her for so long, the fear that she would never be able to fix what she had done, was starting to fade. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long while she felt like there was hope. A few moments later, Alexander led her to another room, and there, playing quietly with a set of blocks, were Sophia and Jackson. They were no longer the tiny infants she had left behind. They were growing, developing personalities, and their eyes lit up with curiosity as they saw her. Maria took a step forward, unsure of what to say or how to act. But when Sophia looked up at her and smiled, something inside Maria broke. She knelt down and held out her arms, and to her surprise, both children reached out to her. Tears filled Maria's eyes as she gently held them in her arms. For the first time since she had left them, she felt complete. The gap that had been between them was slowly starting to heal. She didn't know how everything would turn out, but for now she was grateful for this second chance. I'm sorry, she whispered to them, not knowing if they could understand, but needing to say the words anyway. I'm so sorry. And as she looked up at Alexander, who was watching the scene unfold with a kind expression, she knew that this was the beginning of something new. There was still so much to figure out, so many unanswered questions. But for the first time in months, Maria felt a sense of peace. She was no longer alone, and neither were her children.